I have the privilege to be going around with Patty, who's an Iraq war veteran, who actually lived in Baghdad at the same time that I was in Baghdad. And we lived maybe a couple of miles away from each other. She was inside the US base in the airport, and I lived near the airport. And this is giving our trip even more like a bigger meaning than just what we would be saying. Because it shows that Iraqi civilians and US soldiers who are being sent to Iraq don't have anything against each other. I mean, now we're becoming friends, and I'm sure many of Iraqis and Americans who killed each other in Iraq would have become friends if this administration hasn't put one of them inside the Humvee and the other outside it and made them shoot at each other. So I would be addressing what's one of the very important voices that are missing in the mainstream media and in the mainstream politics, which is the voice of the Iraqi people and their elected officials. And Patty will be addressing the other voice that's missing from the media and mainstream politics, which is the voice of the veterans. We always hear about the troops. When the government wants to continue the war, they say, let's support our troops. But we never hear them talking actually. The same way that the same government says we have to stay in Iraq to help the Iraqis, but they never seem to be asking the Iraqis whether they need help or not. Before I talk about what's happening in Iraq, I want to say that the entire war and occupation of Iraq are just one example of the same foreign policy. And we have to remember this all the time and not think about Iraq as an exception to what the US foreign policy looks like. In fact, it's a continuation of this policy. Now, why do we care about this? We care about it because if it was just an exception, we should be addressing the Iraq war and occupation alone. But because it's a part of a bigger pattern, the pattern that caused previous wars and will cause future wars, I think we should be learning from the Iraq war and searching for real solutions that will prevent future wars from happening. And that's why I will be talking more about Iraq and what's happening in Iraq. But I hope that this will open a space for all of us to discuss what type of foreign policy we have. Because this discussion doesn't happen usually, especially when you come to where I live in Washington, D.C. The limits of discussions are really, really narrow. Usually people in the media and in the Congress, they discuss different options and variations of one policy. One policy that is based on intervention and usually on military intervention. But no one stands up and says, wait a second, why do we depend on interventionism as our only policy? There are other countries around the world who have different types of policies. So no one takes these stands. So we end up discussing the Iraq war. Some Congress members and policymakers want to continue the war, continue the occupation, because they are tough on terrorists. And others want to continue the war and the occupation because they care about the Iraqis. One wants to have like a tough, strong occupation, and the other wants to have a nice occupation. But no one stands up and says, why are we there in the first place? On Iran, for example, one wants to contain Iran by bombing them. And the other voice wants to contain Iran by talking to them. But no one stands up and says, who are we to contain Iran? Why don't we contain ourselves first? So we don't have a healthy space of discussing what type of foreign policy. If we are going to continue the current extreme interventionist foreign policy, or jump to the other side of being isolationists, or pick one option in the middle, the 1 million options in the middle, that's a debate that we should be having, at least to decide who we want to be, right? Because usually how the US government discusses foreign policy issues, they say, we have interests around the world, and we want to get them. So we need oil. That's why we have to go and invade Iraq. Like usually this is right, or like there are other excuses. But then it's okay to have interest in the world, and there are other nations around the world who actually do have interests, but they don't have 130 bases around the world because they do something else other than bombing and invading. They actually buy the oil. It sounds like a very weird idea, but it can be bought, and this is how other nations think. Like China, not to glorify the Chinese foreign policy, China actually buys half of its oil from the Middle East. I've never seen a Chinese bomb falling on our countries, or Chinese intervention in the region. And not to say that China's foreign policy is like a prototype that we should follow, but just to say that there are other people who pursue their interest in different ways. Now, in the case of Iraq, because there is this preset policy that is based on staying militarily and interfering in all of the countries in the Middle East. This is the existing policy for decades. And there are ways to market this policy. So the things that we hear usually are not the basis that the foreign policy is built on. We just hear how the foreign policy is being marketed. So at one moment we had to stay in the Middle East to protect Iraq's neighbors from Iraq. Then it moved to protecting Iraqis from their government. Moved at one moment it was protecting the birds in the Marsh Arabs from the Iraqi government, because the Iraqi government was draining the market. Protecting the birds, to protecting the Kurds from the Arabs, to protecting Arabs from Kurds, Sunnis from Shiites, weapons of mass destruction, human rights abuses. So there's a long list of things, right? So whenever you debunk one of these myths, the government goes to the next one. They have a long list it's like a chain of myths. So today I will be addressing the latest two ones, the two myths that now exist. But we shouldn't have a delusion that by debunking the administration's myths alone, the government will change its policy. It's not like we will go around saying, yeah, they say that Muslims are crazy, violent people who oppress their women. Let's prove to them that Muslims are not. And once we succeed in that, the administration will be like, let's pull out from Iraq. It won't happen this way, right?